In a time of political division and fear of foreign influence, a controversial set of laws challenged the very principles of free speech and individual rights. Here's why the Alien and Sedition Acts still matter today. More things you should know by being alive. So here's the story. So it's the late 18th century, the late 1700s, right? And in America, this was a time of uncertainty. The United States was still just this fledgling nation, and it was kind of grappling with its identity and its place in a world that was dominated still by the European powers. And the administration of President John Adams, who took office in 1797, was marked by intense political and ideological division. And the United States was caught in the middle of a growing conflict between Great Britain and France. And both of those two countries sought to expand their influence in the Western Hemisphere. And there was an increasing fear of foreign threats to the United States' stability. Okay, so in this context in the context of this political tension, right, the Alien and Sedition Acts were passed by the Federalist Party, the Federalist-controlled Congress in 1798. The laws were seen as necessary by many at the time to protect our young republic from foreign influence and also internal dissent. But in reality, they also marked a significant encroachment on civil liberties, and they set a dangerous precedent for government control over speech, the press, and immigration. So, first things first, the Alien Acts. These were a series of laws that targeted immigrants, particularly those from France, who were seen as sympathetic to the French Revolution and potentially dangerous to the United States. These laws allowed the president to deport any non-citizen who was deemed to be a threat to national security, and they also made it more difficult for immigrants to become citizens. The Naturalization Act, one of the components of the Alien Acts, extended the residency requirement for citizenship from 5 years to 14 years, which was a significant increase. This was aimed at limiting the influence of French immigrants, many of whom were seen as more sympathetic to the French Revolution and the French Revolutionary cause than American interests. I kind of got stuck there, sorry. Now, the other half of this is the Sedition Act, and it's perhaps the most controversial of the laws because it targeted American citizens, and it made it a crime to publish false, scandalous, and malicious writing against the government or its officials. This act was a direct assault on the First Amendment, because the First Amendment guarantees freedom of speech and the freedom of the press. Now, under the Sedition Act, several journalists and editors were arrested and tried for criticizing the government, and some were even put in prison. This law was particularly aimed at the growing opposition press, which was led by the Democratic Republican Party. They were the political rivals of the Federalists. The government, fearing the rise of criticism, used the Sedition Act to silence its critics and then suppress the free exchange of ideas. The Alien and Sedition Acts were immediately controversial. Many saw them as overreach by the Federalists because they were designed to crush political opposition and to silence dissent. Thomas Jefferson, who was John Adams' vice president, and he was the leader of the Democrat-Republicans, the opposite party. And Jefferson vehemently opposed these two acts. And in 1798, Jefferson and James Madison drafted the Virginia and Kentucky resolutions, which argued that states had the right to nullify unconstitutional federal laws. These resolutions set the stage for future debates about states' rights and the balance of power between state and federal governments. Now, the backlash against the Alien and Sedition Acts was swift and it was strong. The public reaction, especially in the press, was largely negative, and many people saw it as a violation of fundamental rights, the fundamental rights upon which the United States was founded. Now, as the presidential election of 1800 approached, the acts became the central issue of the campaign, with the Democratic Republicans using the laws to rally support. In the election of 1800, Thomas Jefferson, through a whole other thing, defeats John Adams. It was a whole to-do. And I did a whole other video on the election of 1800. But anyway, And one of the first actions that Jefferson had as president was to call for a repeal of the Sedition Act, and then pardoning of those who had been convicted under the Sedition Act. And by 1802, the Sedition Act had been effectively, it had been allowed to expire, and its provisions were never renewed. Now, though the Alien and Sedition Acts were short-lived, their impact on American politics and civil liberties were lasting. They highlighted the tension between national security and individual rights, which, of course, is a theme that continues to echo throughout all American history. And the laws set a dangerous precedent for government overreach. And their passage demonstrated how political divisions and fear could be used to justify the suppression of dissent. Now, in addition, there's more, right? So the controversy surrounding the Alien and Sedition Acts helped solidify the power of the Democratic Republican Party, and it weakened the Federalists, who really never fully recovered from the political backlash here. And the laws were an early reminder that in times of crisis, the government could use fear to justify the limiting of civil liberties, and that such actions would provoke significant resistance from public and political opponents. Today, the Alien and Sedition Acts are often cited as examples of government overreach and the dangers of suppressing free speech. So, in many ways, they foreshadow later moments in American history when the government has sought to balance national security with individual rights, like the McCarthy era, which I talked about too, or the War on Terror. So the acts remain a significant part of the broader discussion on civil liberties and the limits on governmental power in times of crisis. So here we are again. Why it matters. Why do the Alien and Sedition Acts matter? They matter because they serve as an early warning of the dangers of sacrificing civil liberties in the name of national security. They illustrate how fear, whether a foreign influence or political opposition, can lead to laws that restrict individual freedoms and target marginalized groups. The laws remind us that the protection of free speech and the press is not just a legal right, but it's a cornerstone of democracy itself. The legacy of the Alien and Sedition Acts, they are still relevant today as we have debates over the balance between security and freedom, because those things continue to shape American politics. The acts are a reminder that protecting individual rights require vigilance, especially in times of national crisis. Let's close it up here. The Alien and Sedition Acts were a pivotal moment in American history, a moment when fear almost silenced the voices of dissent. They remind us that the fight for civil liberties is constant, and the preservation of democracy requires the protection of free speech and the press. If you learned something new, if you added depth to your knowledge, right on, right? And I'll appreciate any kind of like, comment, follow, share, question. For more things you should know by being alive, I'll keep churning this stuff out, right? Because knowing the history of the Alien and Sedition Acts, well, it helps us understand the ongoing struggle to balance freedom and security. Thanks for watching.